Welcome to This Week in Coworking, where industry leaders get succinct, actionable insights.
Hey everybody, we're joined this week by Johnny Rosenblatt calling in from London, I believe.
That's right.
Johnny, great to have you here on the podcast. If you haven't heard Johnny speak or you've never pressed pause with him, you've definitely missed out, but no worries. We've managed to rope him in to come join us on the podcast. Before co-founding Spacemade, Johnny founded the Headspace Group, which he led the growth and sales behind, and eventually exited to PE offices in 2017. In 2019, after being harassed, I'm going to say, by landlords trying to do the WeWork thing, Johnny and Dan Silverman co-founded a company called Spacemade. It has been in the newsletter numerous times over the last couple of weeks. Johnny, thank you very much for taking some time out of your day in your beautiful podcast studio there to join us and talk through some of those news topics. First up, Johnny, how are you?
Yeah, awesome. It's really good to be here. Thank you for having me on. I enjoy your newsletter very regularly, so it feels an honor to be in the studio with you. Thanks for having me on, and yeah, good to be talking.
Thanks very much for the kind words and for being a long-time subscriber. I love the fact that not only are you able to your news, but you're able to resonate, kind of comment and give feedback on other people's news and just create a really nice dialogue. So appreciate you being part of the community. Now, for folks who don't know about Spacemade, you are a key player in the Landlord Flex industry. So for folks who are listening in, or maybe you don't know what that is, it's this whole new class of co-working where landlords are trying to figure out, where do they play? Do they keep doing rent arbitrage deals, or do they do management agreements or other types of agreements with operators? Now, Spacemade is 100% management agreement structure, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So what makes what you guys do different from any of the other talented operators out there who are also trying to secure landlord management agreements? What makes Spacemade special?
It's a really good question. I think there's a lot going on in our space. There's a lot of different ways of cutting deals. There's a lot of different operators. And I think all of that feeds into this kind of quite rich tapestry that Flex has developed. We are based, as you said before, in London. We operate across the UK, but London is probably the principal flex market globally. And I think what we've seen in London is a maturity that probably outweighs most other cities globally. And as the market's matured, the way in which flex is delivered has matured. Spacemade, we set up in late 2019. December 19, we opened our first space. Wonderful timing, 3 months before the world was told never to go to the office again. So actually, it was set up on the kind of premise of being a management agreement business, which meant that we were seeing a lot of demand from landlords who were getting their cake sliced by other flex operators. And they needed to find a way of differentiating and creating a product that resonated with the end user. So that's what we did. And actually, our business model hasn't changed a great deal since we founded the business and since we set up, and we've stayed pretty true to our values. In terms of what makes us different, I think probably the first thing really is around brands. So we deliver individual brands for each asset or portfolio that we work with landlords under. And we did that for a very clear reason. We could see that as the market was maturing, so too were the kind of members in those spaces. And what we could see was that actually people didn't want their business, their brand, to be secondary to a large kind of operator brand. The operator brand, yes, it was important, but it didn't need to be the primary focus of any visitor to that business coming into the building. Actually, we listened, and those slightly more mature businesses were the early adopters of our space and have continued to be as we've grown. So I think it's been helpful from a member perspective. But from a landlord perspective, it's important too, because actually it gives them more of a sense of ownership of the product. Now, we have a pretty clean and clear management agreement structure. There are thousands of ways of cutting a management agreement. I think I've heard ours described as one of the most landlord friendly in the market. And that's a really important piece for us, because actually we want this to be a very transparent and open relationship. We genuinely see it as a true partnership. And for us, actually, that kind of landlord engagement is really important. We don't want to have a quarterly meeting or once a year we have a roundup with them. We've created a live dashboard. We create very clear and very manageable kind of reporting. So that live dashboard updates on a daily basis. It gives landlords full visibility of what's going on in their space, good or bad. Most of it's good. Actually, the good or bad is important because we see it as a journey that we're going on together. That's really important. The truth is, all our membership agreements, there is a direct relationship between the landlord and the end user. And I think, again, that's quite an important piece of the jigsaw. Many landlords have been burnt by operators who have folded an SPV or walked away from an agreement. And the key for us is that actually it feels very aligned. And so I think that makes it quite interesting. And I suppose the other piece really in terms of that kind of point of difference or that management agreement is that because we create these individual brands, because we have this kind of very embedded relationship with the landlord, we're able to create the right product for a building. And I think that's really the most exciting piece because there's a freedom to do what is right for the asset. You mentioned my previous business, Headspace Group. And I also think a lot of businesses in the space, generally you're looking for a building that fits your brand, that makes it feel like the right thing for your business. Actually, we look at it totally the other way around. We'll look at a landlord will come to us, we'll look at an asset, we'll look at a portfolio, we'll look at whatever the requirement is. And we go, what is the product that we need to create to make this work for the landlord? And it might feel quite nuanced, but when you flip the kind of equation on its head, it enables you to have a freedom to create something really interesting. And so there's many examples of that. And I'm happy to talk through that in a little bit more detail later, but creating these very specific products for specific environments gives us this total kind of freedom to do very different products. And creatively, that's exciting. But from a landlord perspective, that's awesome as well.
It is really awesome. And I do love the fact that you've had, and we'll definitely dig into some of the unique amenities that some of the Spacemates have. But I want to just circle back a little bit. And yes, each location. So I believe each location has its own brand, or each landlord partner has its own brand.
Each location, some landlords have various locations, but they want to keep it the same brand. But in effect, each location will have its own brand identity.
And so there's obviously a lot of new operators, especially all coming out of the WeWork alumni who are trying to do the completely white label. So you don't even know it's run by them. Spacemate is slightly different. There is something more to there is a Spacemate mention. There is a slight brand there. It does have that little bit of flair. Is there a reason to that? Why have you got gray label as opposed to company?
Yeah, it's a really good point. The truth is, when we first set out on it, we thought, actually, let's create loads of individual brands and that'll be the journey. But very quickly, you realize that firstly, as anyone in the business or in any business knows, brand building is a difficult exercise. So actually, you have to focus on building that individual brand. For us to go and build 15 individual brands, give them all the same gravitas is hard, particularly when it's a standalone brand about one building. To give it that individuality, and then the design is reflected in that, and all the marketing materials reflected that individuality, and even the sales patter and collateral, all of that fits into that point about individualism. But to give it the by Spacemade seal, I think for us has been the right journey because Spacemade is becoming increasingly recognized in the marketplace. It's underpinned by something of quality. And for us, that's the right balance. And look, every operator has their own different way of viewing it. But for us, the building brand or the portfolio brand by Spacemade gives the whole equation what it needs and enables us to actually channel marketing direction to the Spacemade element. And you find the right product through that area. It's a well-trodden path in the hotel world, in all honesty. There are many parallels with the hotel world, in all honesty, when it comes to management agreements, but that's one that seems to work very well. And you get that assurance as an end user. This is of Spacemade quality.
I love that. I was going to definitely bring it home to that hotel reference. I'm so happy that you brought it up because almost every one of these calls I get on, there's some reference back to the hotel world, flags and by Hilton, etc. That kind of piece of it. So I totally happy that you made that recognition. I didn't have to. But it does make me wonder, what does the sales funnel look like for each of these locations? Are people looking for that specific brand, or are people finding Spacemade and then you're routing them to what's best fit? Like, do you have a whole sales operation that helps put people in the right partner location? What does that look like from an operation perspective?
We do. But I think actually what we know is that fundamentally people are driven first and foremost by location. That remains the key driver. Yes, we've got a bit more quantum in certain micro locations. We can help drive in the direction of what fits best for that user. But the key leading priority on a space search, first and foremost, is location. second is pricing. And so those pieces are key. And as much as you want to channel people in certain directions, that actually location is the key driver. I think where it is really interesting, and look, we're about to hit 5 years into this journey, of which several of those were COVID. So it feels slightly shorter than that. But we've now developed a quantum of space that means that we've got bigger conversations to have with the types of inquiries that come in. So we have regional spaces. We're in Leeds and Birmingham, have two great operations in those cities. We have central London locations and we have London suburb locations. And where suddenly we're seeing patterns are people using suburb locations on certain days and then needing that kind of central London hub and meeting or event space in central locations to kind of pull it together. And so those patterns are developing a bit more. And that's the next phase of iterative growth for us, where, as you correctly identify, that sort of sales funnel can slightly start to adjust accordingly. But that's a really interesting journey. And you are often driven by what demand looks like in these situations. And that's a great case in point. So we're building that further, but location is probably the key driver still.
Totally makes sense. So would I be correct to assume that there are around 117 aggregators right now? Are your partner locations listed on all of those if you are primarily trying to be found by location? Or what is your strategy with regards to aggregation, partnerships, third-party brokers? What do you, how do you operate that across 15 brands?
I think there are actually, in the UK, certainly there are more than that. On our last count, I think we had something like, this is slightly more brokers, but we had something like 212 brokers on our database. I'm told there's something like 300 across the UK. And actually, the reality is, of those brokers, I would say there's probably 15 that make a meaningful impact in our business. And then there's probably a kind of another subsection which have a smaller impact, and then a very long tail where not much happens. So the relationships are still key when it comes to kind of broker sales. I'll come on to direct sales in a second, but when it comes to kind of broker and aggregator sales, we still harness the power of kind of those direct relationships between our sales team, our community teams, and those kind of brokers that bring in the right lead flow. If you take that out of it and you become pure kind of integrated aggregator focus, firstly, you lose the joy of what we're doing, but also you suddenly have 300 aggregators and brokers on your books, and most of them are doing very little work for you. So there is a big kind of focus still on the broker market. But as we've grown as a business, we see an increasing flow of direct traffic to us. And that comes about through our own direct marketing channel. We do a lot. We have a really strong marketing team who put a lot of levers in terms of driving the brand, but then also driving the exposure for the individual sub-brands as well. And that drives a lot of traffic. Certain locations, you're going to be skewed slightly more towards the broker market, and other locations, you're getting way more direct traffic. And that's always changing, but we're always focused on kind of both elements, because you can't lose the brokers, and some have great value, others maybe less, but some do bring a lot of value to the table. For us, brand building is a really important piece of the jigsaw, and we're constantly focused on listening to what our customers want, what our consumers want. You may have noticed we rebranded earlier this year in a meaningful way, and I can talk a little bit more about the rationale behind that, but that is a pivotal part of the next phase of growth for us as a business.
I was just about to ask you about that. But before I dive into the new rebrand or your new big, hairy, audacious goal, I do want to ask, or just a note, when I was running through your brand profile before we jumped in this call, I did notice how many times you and your team have run really good outdoor campaigns. Like, it's very rare to see co-working brands in big cities do outdoor, do bus stops, do that kind of stuff. I think you also did a guerrilla campaign a little while ago.
Yeah.
So that all plays into that direct strategy that you're building up and building that brand. Because obviously that helps with your landlord conversations, but it also helps you fill those spaces. Before we dive into your rebrand and the new goal, I just want to reconfirm the average across your 10 locations. Is it mostly offices? Is it mostly hot desking? Like, what is the product mix?
Yeah, product mix is predominantly private offices. I would say we're just slightly under 90% in terms of private offices. Certain locations are skewed totally private offices, and others have a much larger offering of hot desking. Our close to home locations tend to be more of a kind of hot desking mix, so a bigger proportion going that way. But private offices still make up the bulk of what we do. What we're striving a little bit more towards is kind of event space and meeting room focus. Increasingly, there's, I think, that sort of the growth, the return to office is also brought about by this kind of return to bringing people together. And so you've got to ensure that day in the office or 2 days in the office or whatever it might be for a company has versatility in the type of space that people can use. It's not just your 10 people, so here's a 10-person office. It's an office, it's co-working, it's that kind of space where you can break out. It's the amenities, the podcast studios, the climbing walls, but then it's also the event spaces and meeting rooms. So all of those things need to fall into that mix in order to attract people. We're definitely doing more and more kind of event spaces because I think we've identified that need is increasing as we go forward.
Totally get that. And that actually leads me up to the question. So part of your rebrand was the fact you want to cultivate 1 million real world social connections through your spaces. And if you are like most operators who are very profitable or get past profitability, they are mostly private offices. And you get this world of fishbowls of everyone stuck in their private little offices. So what exactly is the thinking behind this goal of trying to get to 1 million real life connections? And how does it play into the fact that you have 90% of around 2,500 members sitting in these offices or in these private event spaces? Like, what does that look like over the next 10 years?
I'll just walk you through the rebrand first, and then we can delve into the sort of the rationale behind it. But we set up the business initially with a focus on attracting landlords. And for us at the beginning, it was, let's get access to the space through the landlords, and then we can start selling across to the end user and to the members. I think what we realized was probably mid 23, late 24, 23, we were starting to hit a point where we had enough critical mass of space. And actually, we needed to find a voice that spoke to the consumer rather than to the landlord. And that was a sort of, a pivot that kind of happened through the evolution of the business. It was a kind of natural progression. We decided that the kind of consumer focus, if you want, was the priority. And so Spacemade became much more a kind of a consumer brand. So again, you've already mentioned sort of some of the work we've done on outdoor advertising, guerrilla campaigns, bus advertising. This is old school advertising, but it's very effective. And it is talking to the top of funnel, the whole kind of population that could potentially be a user of space. But actually, it's about creating an essence. And it would be bad news if I didn't mention Anna, who is our head of marketing, who has driven this project incredibly well. But Anna comes from a consumer marketing background with a very brand heavy focus. And she has built this idea in a very detailed way across the business that has enabled us to do this and run this project. So really, the 1 million connections is about actually what it means to be in the office. So for us, everything we now do within our business is about building meaningful connections. Yes, we can have an event where we get people together, they come out of the office, they come together. We have a community manager that facilitates that. But are those connections meaningful, or are they coming down to grab some food or some drink and go back to their office? So actually everything we do is now about those kind of meaningful interactions. And the reality is that most knowledge workers have a hybrid kind of working pattern where they're not in every day, and some are much more skewed towards working from home, some in the office, and everyone has found a different pattern. But what we've identified is that as an operator, our job is to facilitate those meaningful connections so that when you're in the space, we are reviving the workspace as a hub for actual connections so that you don't have to do everything on screen. You don't have to look at everyone on a different tile on your laptop, because fundamentally, when you're sat in a room with someone, it's more powerful. Like, you can have a better conversation. And were it not for the fact that you're in New Jersey and I'm in London, we would be sitting together right now. And I wish we would. And next time we'll do it in person. But we know the value of it. We can see the value of it. And bringing people together is critical. So those meaningful connections are really important. And that has enabled us to speak to the end user in a way that actually resonates beyond, hey, we've got an office to sell. That's not interesting. That's not a marketing message. That's a product fill, right? And for us, actually, it's about creating this kind of dynamic that people interact with and enjoy, understand, and also gives us the ability to say something that is deeply emotive. And that kind of brand essence is now really running through the veins of our business, like across everything we do, every decision that's made, every conversation that's had internally in HQ. It's all about that meaningful connection. And that's a really powerful piece of what we've done as a business. A rebrand is not just having a new logo and some nice new shiny collateral. It's actually about a brand that is an essence that runs through the kind of all decision making across the business and is underpinned by the values of that business.
Yeah, you said it so well. And as someone who comes from ex-ad agency long before my co-working days in a past life, doing kind of online, offline guerrilla campaigns, there's just something about the simplicity and the humanness of your offline campaigns. So huge congrats to Anna and the team on hard one.
Thank you.
Nailing that. I love sharing it because it's just one of those things where it's just reminding people that the folks who use your offices have human needs, not just office needs. And so huge congrats to you and the team on that. But I want to also just go back to what you were mentioning about those human connections, because there's one thing that you guys do pretty differently, and that's your amenities. So it's not just about coming into the office and having a face-to-face in a podcast or a meeting for a quick lunch. It's also about what you do when you're at the office. And one of my favorite quotes when I used to live in London was I was doing some cycle classes with my fiance at the time, and the instructor stopped the class and just folks should sweat together, stay together, right? Yeah. So when I saw things like rock climbing and additional amenities that are not traditional workspace amenities, that really resonated with that 1 million connections, right? Yeah, you may not know the folks in the other office, but you know that they like rock climbing on Thursdays. So you go and you meet them there and build a different type of connection. What are the top 3 strange to the co-working space world amenities that you're most proud of at the Spacemade network?
I think, the bouldering wall as it is has definitely had a lot of attention, which has been good because firstly, you want to grab attention, you want to differentiate from your competitors, you want to have a talking point that's different. But I think deeper, there's a fundamental excitement behind that because actually, what does it represent? As you said, I think you've summarized it beautifully. Folks that sweat together, work out together. I think that's a really nice point because actually you're creating something that is deeper than the sort of performative stuff that you do at work. Like we can all go and sit in an office and deal with our emails and jump on a Zoom call. But frankly, we could do all of that at home. You have to create a destination that people want to go to. The phrase earning the commute has definitely been bandied about a lot, but I think there's a lot of value in it because you really are competing now, not just with competitors, but you have to compete with home and you have to make it better. You have to increase the dwell time in order to get the value out of it. So the bouldering wall is a great example. We've got a bunch of other amenities that work as well that have been really interesting. Probably none quite as exciting as the bouldering wall, but content creation studios like the one I'm sat at now in Beton in Barbican, these spaces are brilliant because it's very rare that people have the ability to access these spaces without going out in a different direction to find it and knowing they've got to get there. And actually, when it's in your building, it's a much easier thing to use. It's somewhere that you can get together with people. It's a great talking point. It's a great way of getting people to come to you. And so I think that's been quite exciting. We have quite a few sort of Peloton studios and gyms to varying degrees. We're about to open a kind of health tech cluster, which we can talk about shortly, I think. That is a really interesting shift in the way in which we're delivering space, which is sector-specific space. But within that, we're delivering a dry lab, which will be a kind of, for us, is a brand new type of amenity. And we've had to delve deep and get a proper understanding of what that is. But we've got in that space a dry lab, event space. We have a screening room, so you can deliver a full presentation, beautifully decked out screening room. There's an unbelievable outdoor terrace. There's further content creation studios. There's a yoga studio. So, we're not looking to reinvent the wheel all the time, but those amenities are so important to adding additional value to the consumer, to the end user of your space, and actually making your space an attractive place for them to bring their employees together. And sometimes people can view it as a bit of a gimmick, but there's something very powerful in creating something that people want to come to and make use of it in a very different way that is unique to a building.
So true. And what I'm most happy about is when I got into co-working in 2013 and I started launching spaces in Europe and then helped some spaces launch in the UK, it was almost always attached to some sort of drinking culture.
Yeah.
That was like the main thing. Like we have a pub on site, we have a bar on site, there's a pub lunch. It was always like that's kind of how it started in around 2013, 2014. And now we are seeing that shift of fully stocked out gyms, content creation, things that actually you're creating as opposed to just consuming. So I'm definitely so happy to see that. But you did bring up a really good point. And I believe this is your first non-workspace niche location, the one that we talked about in week 45. If you don't know what I'm talking about, hop over to thisweekincoworking.com, hit week 45 and Spacemade, you'll see you've just done a new partnership where you're going to be launching, as you said, a more health-focused type space. And this does open up an undercurrent trend that we've been seeing over the last year, where people who want to do co-working like stuff, but don't traditionally do office space. So we're seeing co-warehousing, like food and beverage, shared kitchens, ghost kitchens, and now things in the health and biotech. Do you think you're going to be moving more into kind of niche spaces, or would you like to?
Yeah, so I think it's really interesting. So just very quickly, the space that we're launching it's actually a cluster of buildings. So it's 3 buildings in Portland Place in central London, a pretty prime location of London. We're launching these buildings in partnership with the Howard de Walden Estate, who are a pretty major landowner in Marylebone, central London. We have about 40,000 square feet of space, and the focus is on the community of health tech. And neighboring that street is Harley Street and the sort of peripheral streets around it that really has a great, deep, internationally renowned history in healthcare and in that world. But what Howard de Walden started to identify was that in combination with that sort of healthcare world and their sort of office portfolio, of which we run a number of buildings for them as well, was that you've got these kind of very smart investors, technology businesses, and then you've got this traditional healthcare route. And so actually the cluster that we're developing, Hale House, is really about creating this kind of flagship health tech space, really designed to catalyze health advancents. And so we're building this ecosystem, of which a big chunk is private offices and event space and meeting space and co-working and everything you would see at any other space, really. But it's about the community that is sitting within that. And everyone within that space must be connected to the health tech industry. And I think it plays into something that's quite interesting, which is that we talked about meaningful connections, right? We talked about, as an operator, we're entirely focused on building those connections and building those routes. So we have a deep expertise and knowledge in building communities, as a lot of people in co-working do. We don't pretend to be these kind of exceptional experts in the world of health tech, but we've spent the last year studying, understanding, and immersing ourselves in it. But actually what we can do in partnership with the users of that space is facilitate those connections. And I think we're perfectly set up to go and deliver that, because we can build the partnerships with the right businesses, the right health tech businesses. We've already signed our key anchor tenant, and there's a number of other tenants that are signing as well. And so we've got the community, we've got the basis of it. Our job really is to obviously do the basics in terms of delivering space and delivering that exceptionally well, but building those meaningful connections and setting up those partnerships. And if you can create a community within a community, which is to say that actually this world exists, there just isn't a hub for it. There's plenty of conferences, there's plenty of people around the world doing incredible stuff. Our job really is to pull them towards this destination and keep them there and keep them engaged in the world in which they operate. And we as facilitators are able to do that. And I think it's a really interesting trajectory for us. But I think actually for the wider co-working world, we have great expertise in delivering these communities. And that's really what it's about. It's so exciting. It's so exciting to be doing something like this. We have another project that's coming further down the line, which will also be industry specific. And I'm really excited about it because I think 12, 13 years in the co-working space, you can see year on year evolution. And I just feel like this is the next iteration as the co-working world continues to mature. It feels really exciting to be able to deliver it. And you go back to the questions right at the top of the show. Actually, what differentiates us is our ability to be quite adaptable, create the right product for the asset owner. We have the freedom to create that product, which I wouldn't have been able to do with my last business because it would have been at loggerheads with the wider brand essence. Here, we're really focusing. We've built the brand, we've built the product, we've got the partnerships. It's a kind of perfect world that we can operate in. So I'm really excited by it, actually.
That's great. There are two little last things I want to touch on, Johnny, before I let you get back to what is obviously going to be a very busy day for you and the team. The first is London primarily is known as one of the most competitive flex space markets in the world. However, news out of this week is that a whole bunch of you multi-location operators have actually done something together and formed what is now being called the Workspace Intelligence Network, in which you all aggregate data and share it anonymously with each other so that you can make better data-driven decisions. You are one of those first 10 founding partners. What drove you to join this initiative? And who's like the leader right now? Is there a leader, or is it just a flat hierarchy of amazing spaces?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's a really interesting development. I think what we and other operators that all individually realized was that there is a sort of a slight issue with the way in which data is used in our industry. And there are third parties that often produce reports and demand data from operators, but that data isn't always necessarily clean. And it's also very often skewed by people sharing, I don't know, really well performing sites and then not sharing underperformers. I think there's probably some slight conflicts of interest now with third parties who have different ownership structures, and actually the way in which they're using data isn't totally transparent. So what this network of kind of 10 key operators in London and the UK have pulled together is to say, look, we all have incredible proprietary data and information, and we're all looking to improve, and we're all looking to get better as operators. Actually, if we can collate that information in a totally anonymized way, so none of us have access to anyone else's info, but all this information gets anonymized, gets sent to a third party auditor who can produce relevant information, we then actually have much clearer stats and figures that can enable us to make better decisions. And so this is our info, and this is what we feel will help us create better space for our users, rather than outsourcing it to a third party who may or may not have totally clear kind of reasons behind sharing it or behind using it. And also, we don't know the true source of it and the true extent of how clean that data is. I will give credit where it's due to my good friend Elliot, who runs Work Life, who has really driven this project brilliantly from the ground up. We have come along a really interesting journey, and I think it's really early stage. This is really just about having ownership of our data and making best use of it and enabling us to make better decisions about future locations, about what micro locations work really well, really what are true desk rates out there, so that we can model and we can create better outcomes for our tenants and our members. And that's really the essence of it. We've so far shared 1 quarter. We haven't actually produced anything yet, but we'll build a database around it. And I think it enables us to have better transparency, and in time we'll give better transparency to the wider market because we'll be able to use that data effectively and in the way we want it to be used. And so I think it's a really exciting project. Again, we talked about hotels earlier. This is not dissimilar to what the hotel world do, and they do this time and time again. And it just gives control back to operators in a way that is not being outsourced to third parties who want to sell your data or maybe, want to do worse. So that's really the reality of it. And I think it'll be an interesting experiment to see how it lands. And it'll also be interesting to see whether this kind of kicks on into other markets as well, whether this should happen in New York and Singapore, where there are really strong markets. I don't know. We'll see what happens.
I'm very much watching closely because, as you mentioned, it's not something new. We borrow a lot of things from hotels. And every time I have seen something like this start, I'm going to not get on my soapbox right now. It all comes down to sustainability, right? How efficient is it for the operators to keep submitting this data and process that data fast enough that the data coming out the other side is actually still,
Yeah.
that's what I've seen time and time again. So I'm hoping, I've definitely pinged Elliot and a few other folks to see how we could help with that. We are not a data warehouse. We just move stuff, data between systems. So I'm very, very curious, both from a professional side, but also just observing, right? If this is something that can work, and operator-led, operator-owned data sets can not only help you make better decisions, but can help the capital markets put a non-zero value on co-working assets, that is a win for the entire industry.
For sure.
And that is one of the undercurrent topics that we're definitely going to be diving into next year as part of our new undercurrents thing. So I'm going to definitely be pinging you some more, finding out how that first quarter went, figure out what does the data look like, and how can it be improved? Because there are such further reaching ramifications of, if you guys and girls get this right, that we are rooting for you no matter who you work with, how you're doing it, whether you have got someone typing into Excel sheets. It doesn't matter. Let's get the first ones done so that we can see the results before we over engineer and bring in some more third parties that you guys don't want.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Your point is absolutely right. Co-working as and flex space as a sub-market of the real estate industry needs to be considered in its own asset class. And that's something I think we've all probably, there's been a struggle in reality up to this point. I don't think it's ever quite had probably the respect it deserves from the capital markets. I think where we're now moving in terms of the direction of travel, the leaning towards flex that sort of has developed post-COVID through necessity, and the leaning towards operational real estate through post-COVID in the office world has meant that now is the right time to go and have that kind of appreciation of what the flex world really does deliver. And the hotel world's absolutely nailed the valuation metric on how you value hotels. We should be doing exactly the same in the co-working sector. And it takes time. These practices, particularly when it comes to kind of valuation and banking and finance, they take a long time to filter through. But actually, if we're not going to do it for ourselves, then who's going to do it for us? So I think that's a big direction of travel. And hopefully the knock-on effects are positive for the flex industry.
Hopefully that all plays out exactly how we all want it to, but we'll see how it all lands and how it keeps being sustained, right? That's the number one thing. I love seeing collaborative projects, alliances, formations, networks, co-branded networks. And I'm like, sustainability, guys, let's get that right first. How do we keep doing this 10 years from now, as opposed to just doing the first one? But that does, what you mentioned does bring me to my last question for you, Johnny. If there was one thing that you wish more landlords, especially those who maybe have burnt by rent arbitrage deals in the past, what is the one thing that you wish that they understood about flex that maybe they don't right now?
That's a big question. I think there's probably still a slight underappreciation of the work involved to deliver flex. And I'm not saying we're doing things that are beyond the realms of human comprehension, but we run operational businesses. Spacemade is not a real estate company. Spacemade is a hospitality business. It's more like, running a hotel, running a restaurant. It's about the people. It's about the nuts and bolts. It's about market trends. And it's about sales and marketing fundamentally. And that's very different to the way the traditional real estate market has always performed. And there are some brilliant sales and marketing businesses. I'm not here to slight anyone at all, but this sort of traditional kind of what we call board up, feet up agency, where you stick a board on a building and wait for the phone to ring, or you wait for it, you ping it out on the portals or see if something lands because your mate happens to have a requirement that works for you. That world of agency, for us, there is so much more that goes into it. We touched on outdoor campaigns, and we touched on the 200 odd brokers, and we touched on the ways in which we can bring people together. But there's so many nuances, and there is so much detail that sits behind creating a flex offering that understanding, I think, is really important. I suppose if you reframe that question slightly, as flex operators, particularly through a management agreement, we also have to understand that a landlord's key metric is about bottom line. And so with all of that information, is for us to filter it and create a bottom line return that is in line with business plan, or it's in line with market ELV or beyond that. And so actually there's two sides of the coin. Our job as operators is to balance all of that and get the right outcome for the landlord. But I think there's a lot more that is required to deliver Flex. And I think a lot more kind of rich data that comes from delivering Flex that you simply don't get in that sort of traditional landlord real estate world. And so I think that sort of appreciation is developing, but I think there's probably more to come from that as well.
Johnny, thank you very much for your time today. Thanks for sharing your insights, best practices, all of that. I'm 100% sure we're going to have you back on the pod. Hopefully we'll do it side by side in those chairs behind you.
We'll have to see.
Next time. But thanks very much for joining me. Where can people find you? What's the best place to reach out to you if people want to just reach out and connect?
Yeah, feel free. Best place probably LinkedIn is Johnny Rosenblatt. Feel free to connect, drop me a message, say hello, or check out spacemade.co if you want to see our products, our locations. But look, thank you as well, Hector. I think what you do for the co-working industry is not to be undervalued, because I think you bring a lot of information together, you create great insights, and I thoroughly enjoy your content that you create, and keep doing what you're doing. Thanks so much.
Appreciate it. Thank you. And thank you for your support.